What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the term's a deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy.
Enjoy.
Enjoy the show. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Politics and Media 101, the place where we hear live and direct from people in the news in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. I'm Jeff Browning, and I'm grateful to you for being here. Today, we're excited to release part of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with Paul Stronski, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment's Russia and Eurasia program. Paul has spent years working at the highest levels of the U.S. government, in the White House and in the State Department, advising leaders on U.S. policy toward Russia. In 2014, Russia took the world by surprise when its military invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula, which had been part of Ukraine. Since then, a conflict has persisted in eastern Ukraine involving pro-Russian separatist forces, and in recent weeks, Russia has amassed large military formations near its border with Ukraine, leading many to wonder whether Russia plans another invasion. While it's tough to tell exactly what will happen, Paul's one of the most knowledgeable people around about this, so we appreciated the chance to have a timely conversation with him and for our audience to ask questions. We hope you enjoy it as much as we did. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
You've served at the highest levels of the U.S. government at a critical time in U.S.-Russia relations, a time when our thinking about Russia and towards Russia completely changed after they annexed Crimea. Can you tell us what it was like being in the decision-making rooms, not only when this was happening, but maybe could you get into how the U.S. posture and thought towards Russia was evolving in real time from one of, no, they're not going to invade, we don't need to keep our tank divisions in the region, to, they invaded, maybe we should look at Russia.
Russia is a very challenging diplomatic partner to engage with. It has long been a challenge to engage with Russia, and I think it's just become more and more of a challenge. In the post-Cold War era, we really have had a up and down relationship with the country. Every single president, with perhaps not the current President Biden, but every single president has tried to have their own reset with Russia, try to improve relations with Russia, and every single time we've done that, relations usually end up in a far worse and worse place. Very often, we think, we do have, some similar, strategic goals as Russia does. I mean, we want to, there are areas where we certainly agree. We certainly agree on the need to cooperate, against terrorism. We certainly agree on the need to cooperate against piracy. But what we're really seeing is a shifting world order, and Russian-U.S. relations are reflecting that shifting world order. Russia in the 1990s was downtrodden, and it was very resistant and there was a lot of anger about its economic collapse, the collapse of the Soviet empire, and the fact that Russia went from the Soviet Union went from a place with 15 republics that stretched from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Polish border and down, to Iran, and then had all these satellite states to one that is just a Trump, a much smaller Russia. And so, we've been trying to manage these difficulties over the last, 3 decades. And what we've really seen is Russia, reinvigorating itself, Russia using its energy wealth to try to sort of re-engage on a global sphere, and Russia being really less predictable than we all thought. Back in 2014, I think a lot of people, we believed that we were beyond this sort of, geopolitical competition between East and West, and we could always come to an accommodation. But Russia saw that it was very concerned about Europe and NATO approaching into what it sees as its sphere of influence. It still hasn't gotten over the collapse of the Soviet Union. Still sees that part of the world as its privileged area, and took some actions that I remember sitting in the White House, and very few people in the intelligence community actually predicted that Russia would annex Crimea, what it did. And so we are dealing with, a country where I think, as we look at Russia, we need to be prepared to think differently, think outside the box, and be expecting surprises. And I think that's one reason why I think this military buildup right now on Ukraine is deeply troubling, because we saw in 2014 that we can have surprises, and I think what we're seeing, not only is the buildup disturbing, but a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Moscow, but also out of Kiev and out of Washington is we seem to be stumbling back in a road where we were in 5-6 years ago.
I'm wondering if you could briefly explain to us why this buildup is so different than the one that we just experienced 9 months ago. Why are people like Fiona Hill, Ambassador McFaul, and other experts taking this seriously? Why is the U.S. posture to share intelligence with Ukraine about the specific buildups? What makes this something where we're like, oh my God, war could actually break?
Well, I think we're at a different, a different trajectory than we were, 9-10 months ago. As you said, it was just when the Biden administration took power. And the Biden administration, when it took power, President Biden and a lot of his foreign policy advisors, there are some clear hawks from Russia's perspective in the new administration. But we've had a very difficult relationship. President Biden made clear that he felt that there should be some consequences over Russian, meddling in the affairs of our elections and the elections of some of our allies in the political systems. We've seen some really atrocious Russian behavior that he warned about, the poisoning of the opposition leader Alexei Navalny. A few years ago, there was also a poisoning of a defector, a former Soviet, a former Russian intelligence agency who was a spy and was now living in exile in the United Kingdom. Somebody tried to poison him with a chemical weapon, ended up actually killing some innocent woman in Britain instead. And then there was a lot of concern about whether Biden would enhance sanctions, and I think the buildup last spring was very much geared towards how far would Biden go, as far as I think it was a warning. It was a warning to Ukraine then that the Russians could muck around and cause problems for them if they needed to, and I think it was a warning to the United States and to the Biden administration that Russia still has avenues to cause problems in the region. What we saw after that was that Biden was certainly willing to hold a hard line. We've been very critical about things like Navalny, things like the human rights area, but Biden's also kind of practical. He realized the implications of cyber security issues and the need for strategic stability. So I guess Biden did have his slight little restart. He met with Putin in Geneva about 6 months ago. They had a fairly good conversation, from what I understand, and they restarted strategic stability, proliferation talks and cybersecurity talks. And so I think that was very much testing how much they could do with Biden. But what we've seen over the past year is, yes, Biden is certainly willing to engage on areas where he thinks and where the U.S. thinks it's in our interests. But on some other areas, we have seen increased military cooperation between the United States and NATO and Ukraine. We have seen Turkey, a NATO partner, a NATO ally, provide direct assistance, talking about creating arms cooperation and construction and manufacturing cooperation. We saw Ukraine use a Turkish drone, the same sorts of drones that Azerbaijan used against Russia's ally in the 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Ukraine has those weapons and started using it. And so I think, whereas it was just a test of the United States, now I think Russia is feeling a little bit more concerned about this growing. I do not see Ukraine being part of NATO anytime soon, but what we are seeing is growing military engagement between the U.S. and Ukraine. We saw that both recently with a visit of senior Ukrainian defense officials to the Pentagon. But we're also seeing, other NATO countries step up their engagement with Ukraine on defense issues. Turkey is the most prominent and probably the most worrying one for Russia, simply because Russia bumps into Turkey in the Caucasus, it bumps into Turkey in the Mediterranean, in North Africa. And so it's a very complex relationship. So what I think we're seeing is whereas before it was primarily indicating that Russia could muck around in Ukraine and testing the United States, I think Biden has enhanced the engagement between the United States and Ukraine, as have other NATO partners. That has unnerved the Russians, and also on top of that, this military buildup that we're now seeing is also occurring where we've seen some very harsh rhetoric coming out of Moscow, including Putin. Basically, denigrating the Ukrainian state. I know when I joined, there was some discussion about, Kiev and Rus. The Russians date the start of their country back to Kiev in the 9th century. So the two countries have been longly tied, but Putin has been talking up a lot of questioning Ukrainian culture, its sovereignty, its independence. And so I think, we are seeing, as have other senior Russian officials, so we're seeing, both a changing security dynamic with NATO and EU membership is off the table, I think, de facto for Ukraine, but greater interoperability with the Euro-Atlantic community is not, and that seems to be occurring, and increasing. And then you've had these, very troubling and disturbing, signals coming out of Moscow. Putin likes to seem. Putin's I think is also looking at his legacy at this point. He's been in power for close to 20 years. He probably will be in power, who knows, however long. I think, we can't just assume, as I said at the start of this, I think way too many American policymakers and analysts and think tankers and government officials, assume what Russia will do. Everybody assumes Putin will stay in power forever. He very well might, but we don't actually know. We don't know what's in Putin's mind. But we are seeing somebody who clearly cares about his legacy. A lot of it has been to both show that Russia is a power. It's a power that matters in the world, and that Russia is a power that matters in its individual region, and Ukraine, because of the historic importance of the country to Russia, because of its strategic importance, on the Black Sea, and because of the increased NATO activity in the Black Sea. Russia simply sees this as a fundamental issue, both for its own security and defense, but also for Putin's legacy, and sort of trying to reconnect the empire in whatever way it is. Might not mean annexing all of Ukraine, but at least might be making sure Ukraine doesn't pivot completely to the west.
Yeah, so I want to follow up here. I want you to transport us into Moscow, into maybe not Putin's brain, but maybe their military advisors, economic advisors. If you're in the West, if let's say you're listening to this chat and you're not following along with international relations day to day or military strategy, I want you to drill down on the thing that you touched on, the strategic importance for Ukraine. Why would Russia want to risk whatever the consequences may be from a strategic standpoint? What does Russia benefit from if they gain more territory, in addition to the cultural importance and the legacy importance and the domestic political gain that Putin?
Well, from a strategic point of view, I think we need to remember that Russia has been invaded from Europe several times, and it's had war. Peter the Great with Sweden, then Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars, and then World War II. With the Nazi invasion, and Ukraine, along with Belarus, were. If we go back to the Swedish area, Swedish time, it will be, the Baltics and that sort of northern route. But this is really a buffer that Russia sees between its core, the core Russian heartland, and a potential enemy. And they basically see their biggest competition. I'm somebody who thinks their biggest competition is probably, more coming from Asia, coming from China. And I can sort of assure that, when I was working at the White House or in the State Department, Russia was not number one on the agenda of numerous secretaries of state or President Obama. It was just one of many issues that they had to deal with. But I think, Russia sees itself and sees the West as its primary adversary. And it sort of sees, the West, and they see themselves as increasingly surrounded by the West. If you just look at a map, in 1989, they had a buffer zone that went all the way to through East Germany. They lost that in 1989 through 91. Then all of Poland, and then all of a sudden in 1991, they saw the loss of Ukraine and Belarus and the rest of the empire, the 15 other former Soviet states. And then a few years later, they saw the expansion of NATO into Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and eventually encompassing parts of the Black Sea. So now we have Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania are all NATO members. The only two in the Black Sea besides Russia that are not NATO members are Ukraine and Georgia, and they both have publicly said they want to be members. And then when we see our increased activity and sort of increased instability coming from the Middle East, coming from through the Black Sea area, through the Caucasus, Russia sees potential instability either coming from Europe or coming from the Middle East up through the Caucasus and the Black Sea. And what's the one buffer country that's there? It's Ukraine. And so I think from a strategic area, they are nervous about not only their hold on Crimea and their fleet, but they see an increasingly militarized NATO in the Black Sea region, and they see that just right off and if Ukraine is increasingly, although it's not going to be a member of NATO anytime soon, I don't think, but if they see increased weapon sales and defense cooperation and all of that, they see that as a threat. And then when you add on the cultural aspect of it, where some, not all Russians, but some Russians, do not see Ukraine as a legitimate, country, or they identify it as Putin and others did in their effort to justify the annexation and to instigate the war in eastern Ukraine, which was a manufactured, instigated war by Russia. You sort of they tried to label Ukrainian as ultra nationalist elements. And it's really kind of interesting. I mean, I think Ukraine has developed its own in the last 5 or 6 years, and I think this is what the Kremlin doesn't understand: is Ukraine is increasingly its own state. It's got a functioning state. It might not function as they might have corruption problems, but their military has been reformed in the last couple of years thanks to Russia and thanks to the threat. They are working on improving governance. And one thing the Russian aggression against Ukraine has done is it's really created this unifying anti-Russian nationalism in Ukraine. I think a lot of Russians, particularly those in the Kremlin, don't realize that in the last 30 years, Ukraine has become has changed a lot. But I still think that they don't comprehend some of that, and so basically they don't comprehend the sort of the cultural shifts in Ukraine, but they do see a shifting, potentially shifting geopolitical and security situation that, particularly if Ukraine is seen as pivoting to the west, gets rid of their buffer zone.
So, Paul, I wanted to get into what Putin's rationale with this buildup. Let's assume that he is inching towards pulling the trigger. I want to get into some of the considerations here. First, though, the first consideration is that he seems to be thinking that Ukraine matters to Russia more than it does to the West because of the cultural, the legacy, and the strategic implications that you just outlined, that Russia is willing to fight a war over Ukraine and the West is not. Is this true? Simply put, would Western countries, maybe in the EU, NATO, the United States, be willing to intervene directly with military?
That's a very combustible question. And it's a very difficult one to answer. I'll go back to something that President Obama said around 2014. It was probably around the annexation. I'm paraphrasing; it's not his exact quote, but Ukraine will all than it does to me because what do we care about our former allies, and we care about our immediate neighborhood, just like the Russians do. And I think if you look at the U.S. track record, whether American public is tired of overseas entanglements, that is, in 2014, 2015, President Obama, put a red line about the use of chemical weapons in Syria, but he did not enforce that red line because the American people didn't want to see American young men and women go to war for Syria. And I think the pullout, the tiredness of the American public after 20 years in Afghanistan, and the pullout of Afghanistan certainly gives the image of the United States is not is focused more inward, and is retreating from the Eurasian space, retreating from the Middle East. And I also think our pivot to the Indo-Pacific, this new Australian, UK, US agreement, the agreements with India and Japan, we are signaling that this is a region that doesn't matter as much as it did before. And so I think multiple. This isn't just the Biden administration. The Trump administration signaled this at times, as did the Obama administration. And I think if you just look at our track record, we're perfectly willing to send lethal aid, but we're not going to put American lives on the line. And I think I think we certainly, if Russia goes to war, and it's not a certainty that it will, but if it does, try to provoke something or try to ensnare Ukraine into provoking something, that's probably more likely. This is also a test to see how we would react. But I think we're pivoting away from the region. We're pivoting away from boots on the ground. We certainly might provide drones. We might provide other sort of moral support, financial support. But I don't see the United States willing, or most of its NATO partners willing to, go toe to toe over Ukraine. That said, certainly the Baltic republics certainly care about Ukraine. Poland certainly cares about Ukraine. The other countries on the Black Sea do as well, and particularly Turkey does. And so, I could see, individual NATO countries providing greater assistance. I could certainly see us providing intelligence and other support, but I do not see a U.S. president in the current reality of our politics today of really committing anything more than sort of diplomatic and behind the scenes aid. And so I think we all need to tread very carefully. I think if you go back to 2008 and the Georgia war, Russia invaded Georgia. I think, former Georgian President Saakashvili probably thought he would get more active support from the U.S. than he did. And he didn't. And I think, our push towards, our knee-jerk response to the last 10 years has been sanctions as opposed to trying to, use any robust military might.
Yeah, so following up on that, and you have already hit on this a little bit, state building, but all state building aid, defensive aid from the West, from President Obama, from the United States Congress under President Trump. So getting into what that actually means, I mean, we look at the invasion of the initial invasion of Crimea and the annexation of the Donbass region, and looked like it was pretty damn easy for Putin to go in, use his little green men, and win some territory without too much bloodshed or coin spent in the process. Is the current, though, military capacity of Ukraine enough to deter Russia from invading further? Or might Russia feel confident enough to try and seize the land along the Azov Sea and maybe Kiev?
I mean, I think certainly areas around the Sea of Azov is certainly a possibility. I think Russia, certainly Crimea was very easy. That's because nobody expected Russia to do it. I literally remember having a whole bunch of analysts come to the White House and saying Russia would not do this because it's not in its strategic interest. And then 3 weeks later, they said they did it because it was in their strategic interest. But Crimea certainly was fairly easy. The Donbass, and they tried to film else held. The areas, the separatist regions in Ukraine are smaller than Russia's ambitions for them actually were. So certainly I think Russia would they be crazy enough to try to go for a full scale invasion of Ukraine and try and split the country or to the country? I sort of would doubt it. What we sort of see. Russia in whether that is in Crimea, whether that's been in Syria, in Libya, they look for opportunities, they take them, and they don't go overboard. So I think they'll be very opportunistic, and this is why I think Ukraine needs to be careful not to fall into any Russian traps. But the other thing I think is from everybody I talked to on Kiev on the Ukraine side, Ukrainians are willing to fight. And so they're not surprised. They won't be taken as much by surprise as they were in 2014. And they've had now, 6-7 years of professionalization of their military. So I think it will be a much tougher. Certainly, Russia can cause a lot of problems. Certainly, Russia could do this. I think there would be certainly a lot of resistance. And if it's something, if this does come to fruition, which I hope it does not, I fear it could be very bloody, both for the combatants, but more worryingly for all the civilians that are there. I think Russia, could be trying to do a couple things. It could be trying to to force Ukraine back to negotiating table and to maybe say it will stop some of this closer engagement with the U.S. and NATO and Turkey. It could try to the sort of Ukraine in as part of the Minsk agreements. Hasn't really done everything it was supposed to do either. It was supposed to sort of decentralize the government. It could be an effort to try to reinvigorate that problem or reinvigorate that process. I don't think nobody kind of wins off of that agreement, though. It seems to be very much in the past. Or they could simply try to go to get a couple areas. I think trying to get Kiev would be very, very, very deadly and very troubling. But maybe get some sort of land bridge along the Sea of Azov, the port of Mariupol, or something like that. I think maybe could be what they're doing. But again, as I said before, Russia is an unpredictable entity, and me sitting here in in Washington D.C., it's hard for me to get inside of Putin's mind and know exactly what it is. This also could be part of diplomatic gamesmanship. We've seen indications that President Biden and President Putin might have some sort of whether it's going to be a video engagement like Biden just had with his Chinese counterpart or something else in the next few months. This could all be some effort at that, but I think they're certainly playing with fire. The Russians are, and they've certainly laid the gauntlet out that should they want to go into Ukraine, they've tried to lay that groundwork. Both diplomatically and with the Russian people at home, and they basically, whereas before, they've taken some divisions that are, generally in the Caucasus, move them up, 1,000 of miles, away. So it certainly looks a little bit more troubling, now than it did. But hopefully, I don't know, but maybe this is just a diplomatic maneuver. But it certainly looks a little bit more troubling than that.
I want to get into something that you just said back when Russia initially invaded Ukraine. You said that all of the intelligence, or all of the analysts at least, came in and said that they wouldn't do it. And then all of a sudden they did. And 3 weeks later, they're like, well, they of course they were going to do it. It's in their best interest. What is going through your mind when something like that happens? Like when there's a major flip-flop like that and there's just a bungling of intelligence where you have one side who's basically cohesive that it won't happen, then it does happen. Like you're in the White House. What is going through?
You want to scream and you want to point out exactly what they said 3 weeks ago. One thing that's interesting is that, that when I was in the White House, the people who were actually looking at sort of the Russian economy, Russian domestic issues, kind of knew that Ukraine in 2014 was very much like Russia was. It had Russia had just come off of these huge protest movements. The leadership was not very popular, huge corruption problems, and then all of a sudden there is a bottom up revolt, and a corrupt a corrupt autocrat is thrown out of power. What I think the people who actually got it right were more the people who looked at sort of Russia's internal thinking, internal politics, recognizing that the precedent of a leader being overthrown bottom up in a country that is linguistically, half of the country of Ukraine speaks Russian as a native language, and others, speak Russian as a second language. It has a lot of the same, demographic and other issues, and so I think, the shock of what happened. There were a lot of domestic drivers that pushed Putin to do, what he did, and this is why I think we can't diminish this idea that Putin might want to be legacy building. He's sort of created himself. I mean, first of all, he has with the Georgia War in 2008, he sort of recovered some territories and gradually. They're not formally annexed into Russia, but they're de facto annexed into Russia. Then he has Crimea and sort of the Donbass. They moved in the last year to sort of have much closer integration, trade with the Donbass. And we also have sort of seen, Putin really put out this idea of trying to Eurasian economic union, a sort of a Soviet Union light type of entity. So there's domestic rationale for both Ukraine as the most important former Soviet state. It's where Russian history. Putin is also his legacy building of being a state builder. And so I think there's also some there's certainly the geopolitics here, but there's also some of the domestic drivers that we see that could play on Putin. So or could play on some decision making. And I think when I look back at 2014, I think it was the only people who could imagine Putin taking such a careless risk were people who actually were recognized that Putin might feel insecure by what happened. And they were the one who could think out of the box. And now I'm just sort of wondering, and I hope somebody at the White House, somebody in the intelligence community, some analyst that the Biden administration is listening to now is thinking outside the box, to sort of see what scenarios are. And it could be something that we're not even talking about. What the possible, U.S. Responses could be. But I think, we always need to be ready for the surprise. And we always need to be ready to, think, because Russia surprises us numerous times. I mean, we didn't expect it to go into Syria. We didn't expect it, in many ways, they shouldn't have tried to push us out of Afghanistan. They spent years trying to push us out of Afghanistan. Russia doesn't always do what is intrinsically or what we think might be in their interests.
Thank you for that, Paul. Now we're going to go to the meat and potatoes of the Clubhouse discussion, which is questions from our audience members. Folks, just remember the following. Wait for your name to be called on. Obviously be civil and respectful, and try and be quick with the question. So we're going to start with Ab, and then we'll go to Amit. Ab.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you for having me. Paul, this has been a wonderful discussion. So my question is, as you have so masterfully given examples of what Putin had and Putin and Russia to a larger extent had to gain from an invasion of Ukraine, could you take us into the risk analysis of what they would have to lose both domestically and internationally if such an invasion?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I mean, I think Russia thinks, the world is trending in its favor right now. Oil prices are back up high. The European Union has tried to sort of sever, move towards green energy. And now we have this new, winter energy crisis. We've seen a whole lot of fumbling by the United States on a global sphere. We're seeing a rising China. We're really seeing, Russia. Sanctions certainly hit, but oil prices are coming back, and so we see a Russia that sees a declining Europe, a declining the United States, and sees what it has, rising for itself, and see positive things. A couple things though that I think are there. First of all, the Ukrainian public would certainly, and we're going to see, Russia's annexation of Crimea turned a generally very friendly country towards Russia into an enemy that will always be there. And I think it'll take a generation or two before you can have that reconciliation. So you would really turn the population even further against you, and that would make sort of any sort of governing of the area whether it takes any control or not, far more challenging. I think also there's the potential for the civilian casualties. And when Russia has fought wars, in the past, they've been trying to be very careful. Just like, as I said, the Americans, young men and women, to go off to war and fight and die. The Russian public doesn't want their young men to go off. And fight. And so what we've seen Russia very often outsourcing, whether the separatists and the paramilitaries. That's not there are Russian troops, of course, in and around, but the major part of the separatist movement. Started with a bunch of irregular forces. We've seen Russian irregular forces, paramilitaries in Syria. We've seen them in various parts of Africa. This is all a way to sort of do war on the cheap and be able to have deniability so that your population doesn't know about all the the coffins coming home, and so there's also a potential problem for that. We do and Russian domestic backlash. I also think generally Russian-Chinese relations have been growing and growing and growing quite well, and Russia, China does not look towards separatists. It does not look kindly towards separatists. It does not look kindly towards countries annexing another country's territory, unless you're China annexing it, of course. And so this could also cause some difficulties in that relationship as well. But at the same time, I also think I think relations are between Russia and the West are deteriorating very quickly. And have deteriorated. You are seeing. Of course, there will always be tension between the Eastern European partners of NATO and Russia. You see much more willingness of people like Chancellor Merkel and the French. And right now, even a little bit of willingness on the U.S. part to sort of engage with Russia in certain areas. If Russia goes through with this, we're just going to see more and more of a freeze, and that and an effort to isolate Russia and so from the West. And so I think it certainly would cause some reputational risks for Russia globally. And the other aspect, I think, much of what we saw in 2014, the annexation of Russia, highlighted to Russia's neighbors that Russia is not really a reliable friend or partner. So what we've seen since 2014, although the Eurasian Union was created, the other member states of the Eurasian Union tried to strip out as much of anything that could formally unify them, any political commitments that it could have. So Russia's unpredictable behavior also raises questions about Russia among some of Russia's closest allies. If they can throw Ukraine under the bus so easily, why can't they throw Kazakhstan or Armenia or whatever?
Thank you for that, Ab. We will go to Amit and then John Gunnison.
Hey, it's Amit in Chicago. Thanks, Justin and John and Paul. Thanks for your time here tonight. So, how much of Russia's federal budget relies on oil, and is the Kremlin feeling emboldened with prices at this level? Also, just out of curiosity, what's the Putin succession plan? Is he going to die in office or do a Boris Yeltsin and name his successor?
I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have the exact, percentage of what it depends on oil, but they can balance the Russian budget. It's around $40 a barrel. And I think the last I read, oil was up to about $80 a barrel. So, they certainly, the energy prices are rising. And that makes Russia a little bit complacent. They're not necessarily thinking about the future of energy, and we're seeing, a huge shift in energy markets. So, Russia is very, temporary looking. It might not be looking, long term. And I think this is another thing that we need to think about. The people who are running about the Kremlin, who are ruling the Kremlin today, they care most about the regime, the ruling regime, the Putin regime, the Kremlin regime. They care less about the Russian people. And so they're very short-termist. And so, high oil prices, right now are very, very good for them. They might, the short-term win of gaining Crimea might have been very good for them, although the sanctions and then, trying to subsidize the Donbass, has all taken a toll on the Russian budget and Russia's ability to, provide social services to its population. So what I think the regime Russia is doing is what the Kremlin is doing is more envisioned to protect the Putin regime than it is to, push for the welfare of the Russian people per se. As far as who's going to replace Putin, that's anybody's guess. He seems to have is creating a changes to the Constitution, changes to electoral. He's reshuffled some of the his long-standing advisors and brought in some new people in. But it certainly looks like he's intending to stay there for a while. And the problem that I think, the Russian system is it looks very, very strong, but in some ways it's quite brittle because a lot of the decisions depend on one guy. And not everybody knows what that guy is thinking. Putin has created a system over the past 20 years where any sort of credible alternative, whether that is Mr. Navalny of the opposition, who was poisoned, or whether that is somebody else from the system, the political system itself. Anytime that they've shown too much ambition or shown too much potential, they've gotten sidelined. And so he's created a system where it all depends on one person, and where there's no credible alternative to him. Dmitry Medvedev was once a credible alternative to him, but we all know how that ended up. That I think raises big questions over what happens if Putin keels over tomorrow, and also what happens in the longer term for the country. I think it's very unclear who will take over for Putin because there's no obvious clear successor because they've created a system that has prevented that. A successor either from the opposition or from within the system, from an obvious successor from rising up.
Thank you for that question and answer, good sirs. We will go to John Gunnison and then Igor. John.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm wondering if I could maybe try to tap into your expertise in Central Asia, kind of looking away from Ukraine for a second. Sure. I know that on the NSC, you also handled matters with Central Asia. You wrote a book about Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan. And this seems to be a pretty little studied and little understood region for American experts. When we're talking about Russia, and you mentioned Kazakhstan in the last one of your responses, I think your response to AB, and the countries around the periphery of Russia, like Kazakhstan. We're looking at how Russia is fighting to maintain control, economic control, and influence over these countries on their periphery, former Soviet republics. A country like Kazakhstan not only is a member of the BRI, but is actually the country where the BRI was announced. And it's the site of the Korgos Gateway, one of the most significant projects on the BRI. We know that in Ukraine, Euromaidan started because during the EU association agreement and during the Eurasian Economic Union were hard choices. You could only do one or the other. Yanukovych chose one, the people chose the other, and hence we had Euromaidan. Kazakhstan, it's not exactly the same thing because it isn't a hard choice. Kazakhstan remains a member of the Eurasian Economic Union while being this important site for BRI. But we don't necessarily know how these Chinese economic instruments are going to evolve. So do you see a potential future where this is the source of tension and conflict, not necessarily hot conflict, between China and Russia? And in general, how are countries like Kazakhstan and Central Asia handling?
Well, certainly. Thank you very much for that question. It's a very good question, and one of the things that I think we need to remember, in the Clinton administration and in the Bush administration, one of our goals for Central Asia was to and the Caucasus, the Caspian Sea, was to help these countries break free of their transportation and sort of dependence, infrastructure dependence on getting their oil and gas out to markets, sort of to lessen their dependence on Russia. We all saw this as potentially either going in a pipe stream in some ways, going across Afghanistan at some point, or through the Caucasus. And sort of breaking that monopoly was helping these countries break that monopoly was one of the U.S.'s goals. We actually, in some ways, the region achieved that, but the region achieved that more thanks to China than to the United States, because the bulk of the energy from the region is now flowing eastward, and some countries like Turkmenistan are almost 100% fully dependent on their economies. On their exports to their oil and gas exports to China, no longer dependent on Russia. So what we've seen is a real big shift in sort of economic power in the region, shifting away from Russia. The Chinese economic footprint is particularly large, as I said, in Turkmenistan, in Tajikistan, and in Kyrgyzstan. Also quite large in infrastructure in Kazakhstan. So we really are seeing that. What we're seeing is we're trying these countries. They, in some ways, are in a similar situation to Ukraine in that. They see on both sides of their borders, they see potentially aggressive neighbors, and what these countries are trying to do is they're trying to balance between the two of them, they will talk about sort of the sort of Eurasian Economic Union and potential political integration. Uzbekistan is now talking up to Russia about potentially joining it, whether or not it will, very very uncertain. But what we're seeing is you're trying to see these countries sort of balance both Russia and China. And the one thing that makes this even more hard is when we were in Afghanistan, they could have a trilateral balance. They could sort of balance with the United States, Russia, and China. Without us there, both Russia and China, were eager to get us out of Afghanistan. But what we're seeing is, we in many ways provided broader security, our presence in Afghanistan for the region, and we are seeing Russia and China trying to step up some of their security presence, security assistance. We now see some Chinese boots on the ground in Tajikistan. Don't see that in Kazakhstan, but we certainly see enhanced Chinese political presence there. And so I think we are seeing a deep shift. And before. China was seen as the economic engine and Russia was the political engine. But I think increasingly in the future, as Chinese investment grows, China is more and China is deeply concerned about its Xinjiang region. China is growing its political and security footprint in the region of Central Asia, and that could cause some friction down the road. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of efforts by these countries to engage Europe, to engage the United States, but also engaging other partners that have deep pockets, whether that's Korea, whether that's Japan, or India, that doesn't have perhaps as deep pockets, but certainly has equities in the broader region too, to sort of try to create a new balancing act. So it's not just them, Russia and China.
Thank you for that question, John, and that great answer, Paul. So we're going to go to one last question here from Igor, and then we will end. Igor.
Appreciate it. So I do realize that Ukraine, we have a defense agreement with Ukraine because they gave up their nuclear arsenal to Russia. Part of our agreement is to protect their national sovereignty. Is there any possibility that might possibly backfire, specifically, like from the PR perspective? Because I do know that like back in 2018, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a provision preventing American forces from training certain Ukrainian forces that were leaning very far to the right. The right sector, the Azov Battalion, being an example because of them having neo-Nazi connections, and that goes back quite a ways back to the history of Western Ukraine. Is there any possibility that might potentially backfire on the administration or on the optics?
Well, I think the Russians are certainly going to push that narrative. I think we right sector and these more hardline brigades and groups that have been fighting on Ukraine's behalf are certainly a problem, and they certainly certainly provide Moscow, particularly with sort of propaganda wins. I think the fact that the United States is broadly aware of that ideology, broadly aware of some of these Russians, a lot of these Russian separatist elements have committed horrific, crimes against humanity. Some of these other groups have committed some pretty horrible things too. And so I think, we are aware, the United States is aware of those groups. And one of the things that we've really been trying to do since 2014 is work with the proper established military of Ukraine on training and enhancing its institutional capacity, so it does not need to rely on some of these more irregular brigades. But I think this history of Western Ukraine, it's very contested. It's something that's very combustible. Russia will always try to take advantage of the sort of the very sad and bloody World War II and post World War II legacy of that region, and there was atrocities committed by numerous sides in that, but I think Russians will always focus in on the right sector and these Ukrainian far right groups, and I think Ukraine has tried to sideline them, and we in the United States, as long as we are pushing our assistance towards the more regular groups, I think that is certainly where we should be pushing and doing. So I think some of those efforts recognized a couple of years ago are right, and we'll see where it goes. But hopefully. We've had, the head of the CIA was just in Moscow a short while ago, clearly made our points clear. And so hopefully, there'll be ways to, step down and de-escalate this before we get to that position, because, there are, innocent lives on the line, and there's, Europe has refugee crises, and we don't want to have more refugee flows, and we don't want to, there's just when you read about when you take the geopolitics out of this war, it's a really distressing and disturbing and very sad, prospects when you look at how this has affected families, lives, and economies in both Eastern Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, other parts of Ukraine, particularly in the borderlands. But then just the trauma of the people who've lived through this, and hopefully we don't hopefully our diplomats and our can work to try to de-escalate the situation along with Europeans and others, and hopefully some level-headed Russians.
So Paul, you just hit on some refugee crises. I gotta ask. We originally set this discussion up to be Belarus and Poland, and then the news kind of shifted. Still in the former Soviet Union region, though. But bringing us to this will be my last question for you, and then obviously I'll kick it to you for last thoughts. But there is basically a migrant surge being, created or exacerbated by Lukashenko and Belarus, where a lot of migrants are coming from Syria and other places, and they're going into the border of Poland, and you have Polish officials basically saying that this is a very destabilizing situation going on. So I was wondering, I'm not going to ask you if Russia's involved. I don't think our intelligence officials know from the New York Times article I read. But how do you see this situation resolving amicably? Does Belarus and Lukashenko get something out of it? Or is there another way that this kind of de-escalates and everybody chills out and he stops trying to destabilize a country? And
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if Russia is behind this. Russia, Lukashenko is in many ways his own actor, and he has his own problems with. I think this adds one more headache for Russia in East-West relations, because Lukashenko is supposed to be able to be controlled by Moscow, and he's not always controlled. But what we have seen Lukashenko. Some people call it weaponized, but certainly take advantage of the tremendous desire of people in the Middle East, Iraq in particular, but other places, parts of Afghanistan, the Middle to get to Europe, and the fact that most of them usually go through areas that are geographically on the way. This by opening up the borders and facilitating travel to his country, facilitating the ability of smugglers to take advantage of those weapons. He certainly brought thousands of people and used them as a way to try to intimidate Poland and the European Union. I would say the Europe's posture here is not great either. I mean, Europe in some ways set itself up for this because they did not want refugees coming from Turkey and other places a couple of years ago, and settled deals to provide money to Turkey to keep them there and to keep them in other parts of Africa so they wouldn't come. So Lukashenko saw this as an opportunity and a sort of a way to weaponize. And I think some of the treatment of these refugees when they were trying to cross into Poland by Polish officials and Polish border guards, and the Polish very extreme government has not has been pretty awful. But this is certainly the European Union is trying to get these countries, the countries where they're from, to take them back. We're seeing that happen, trying to get them stop the flow. We've seen that happen. But I don't necessarily see Europe doing any sort of deal with Lukashenko like they did with Erdogan a few years ago. And what we're seeing is now he's also creating some problems for himself. Lukashenko is, because some of these refugees, they realize they're not getting into Poland, but they don't necessarily want to go back. And some of them are now thinking about applying for asylum in Belarus, which is not any more welcoming to foreigners than Poland is. And so, he's also creating this problem. And now he seems to want to, desperate to either get some of these people out to Europe and some of these people out to back to the Middle East. So what looked like a brilliant weaponization of migrants a couple of weeks ago is potentially could backfire on him. He's going to get probably more sanctions. The Belarusian airline is going to probably get sanctioned, and as are others. But it's the problem once again. Is we can talk about the geopolitics of this, but people are dying and people are freezing, and little children and old elderly people and on the Polish Belarusian border, and so there's clear humanitarian needs to deal with these people.
Yeah, it's absolutely awful. Well, Paul, I have to thank you. You went into Russia, Ukraine, U.S., EU responses. We hit on Turkey. We touched a little bit on Armenia, and I'm part Armenian for everybody, and Azerbaijan, and then we just hit Belarus and Poland and the EU, and again, Turkey there at the end. So your breadth of knowledge has been very impressive. You've definitely given everybody more a base of knowledge so that we can then understand maybe some of the more complexities and nuances when we're reading these news stories. And God forbid, if anything does actually touch off there. But what are your last thoughts? What do you want to leave us with? It could be anything Russia related, EU, anything you want, US policy. It could be positive, it could be negative, or somewhere in between.
Russia in many ways is I'm be some sort of diplomatic off-road. I'm not certain there is. But I really do hope that Russia is not willing to go for the jugular. And I do, Russia, in Ukraine, there's certainly indications that it is certainly possibly preparing to do something, but Russia's got geopolitical challenges in Central Asia. It's got a continued instability in the Caucasus, where it has peacekeeping troops on the ground. It's got its issues in Syria, and so. I think, I'm hoping that will all give, the Russian leadership a little bit of pause, that Russia faces, Russia is can be a very aggressive player, but it also faces these other broader challenges. And hopefully, they'll realize that there may be better ways to deal with this situation. But because I think, I think we can all debate the geopolitics and the foreign affairs and all of the interesting, diplomatic and military turns, but lives are on the line. Whether it's migrants, whether it's instability in the Caucasus, whether it's Afghanistan or Ukrainian civilians and soldiers and Russian soldiers. And I think we need to remember that, and hopefully the people making decisions will remember that it is human lives on the line and take that into what they're doing.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Paul for coming out, to the Carnegie Endowment, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. If you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.